Lord help me, I am back on my bullshit. RE-ANIMATOR, directed and written by Stuart Gordon, was released in 1985 under Empire International Pictures, working as an adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft short story of the same name. The franchise, which includes the 1990 Bride of RE-ANIMATOR and the 2003 Beyond RE-ANIMATOR, both directed by Brian Yuzna, follows the life of acclaimed, if unhinged scientist Herbert West and his obsessive desire to effectively cure death through the reanimation of dead bodies. Gordon initially pitched RE-ANIMATOR as a modern-day Frankenstein, motivated by a desire to deviate from the supposed abundance of vampire flicks, as well as the sequel fatigue of most slasher franchises. And though its initial release was positive, garnering mostly favourable reviews which praised its sense of humour and gory special effects, it has since been celebrated as a truly beloved cult horror text and has maintained a successful legacy until present day.
Whilst often explored for its relationship with canonical Gothic literature, RE-ANIMATOR has plenty of material worthy of academic intervention even outside of this. Historically, body horror, the purveying subgenre of horror with its roots in 18th century Gothic and science fiction literature, often reflects a specific corporal and societal anxiety. It provides an apt commentary regarding the socio-historical climate in which it was released and influences contemporary culture henceforth.
An especially evocative example of this theory is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was written in response to the growing interest in science and medicine amidst a puritanical Christian culture, and what this interest in the wrong hands might lead to. Before cinema, body horror was used extensively by the iconic Grand Guignol Theatre, whose gore and graphic special effects were often so extreme that it caused theatre patrons to faint. The Grand Guignol's introduction of naturalism in horror unmasked brutality of contemporary culture. Where previously horror served as escapism, dealing with the supernatural and unrelatable, the Grand Guignol introduced relatable topics into the genre, fears of revenge, insanity, and brutal sadism, similar to what the slasher genre would introduce to 70s cinematic horror. The audience could visualize the plots taking place, and thus experienced greater fear.
The Grand Guignol also extensively depicted a lot of medical body horror, an evocative example being
Le Laboratoire des Hallucinations,
in which a doctor takes revenge on his wife's lover by giving him a graphic lobotomy on stage. Considering that these medical themes would purvey to be a long-standing trope in body horror films, it's interesting to see it explicitly represented since its very roots.
As part of the body horror cinematic canon, RE-ANIMATOR depicts the grotesque and psychologically disturbing violations of the human body, permitted due to the accessibility and popularity of practical effects and gruesome makeup artistry in 80s horror, as well as negotiating the theoretical concepts of surrealism, life, and death. It also has a particularly interesting place amongst a host of other 80s body horror, from subtle to sickening, many of which being thought to potentially replicate the wide anxieties and traumas of the 1980s, specifically the AIDS epidemic and a nationwide fear of disease.
Which is just such a rabbit hole in itself, it deserves its own video. RE-ANIMATOR has seen its fair share of analysis within the realms of academia. What with its successful contribution to the 80s horror landscape, its vain cult appeal, and it effectively kickstarting the career of several cult horror icons. But I feel there's something missing from the mainstream analysis of RE-ANIMATOR. So let's get weird with it. Would you believe if I said that I ironed this shirt just so I could do this bit? The budget's gone up, man.
Today's episode will be examining the RE-ANIMATOR franchise through a queer lens, and how it replicates already well-established queer horror tropes. It will also be examining its depiction of queer coding and homoerotic imagery alongside its depiction of body horror, and how that may replicate the socio-historical climate of queerness at the time of its release. It's good to be back. Though the franchise and its legacy is often associated with the character of Herbert West, many would argue that RE-ANIMATOR and its sequel, Bride of RE-ANIMATOR, actually focuses more so on Dan Kane. Dan is a medical student at Miskatonic University, studying under a full scholarship, well liked by the other members in his faculty and dating the dean's daughter, Meg Halsey, whom he plans to marry after graduation. Dan seems to have the perfect life. Until Herbert shows up anyway. Almost immediately, Herbert is presented as Dan's foil, a literary device used where one character complements and highlights the other, often through extreme contrast, and vice versa. The relative purpose of the main character/foil character dynamic is to emphasize the distinction between characters, and this can either be used by the characters being exact opposites, or them being very similar but with one key difference, especially represented in texts like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in which normality and monster are two aspects of the same person, and Jackal, the normative, has desires that only Hyde side the monster can act on. It is this contrast between two characters that gives you a better sense of who they are and how they are used through the text. Milner writes, foils create tension and conflict between characters, and using this technique creates complexity and poignant statements and creates connections with the audience. In RE-ANIMATOR, while Dan is emotional and empathetic, invested in his patients to an almost worrying degree, Herbert is cold and calculated and sees most human life as lesser than his own. Where Dan is yielding and susceptible, Herbert is bossy and demanding. Even their physical appearances seem to contrast each other, with Herbert small and somewhat feeble-looking, and Dan larger and more muscular.
The use of this dynamic not only makes the pairing of Dan and Herbert all the more appealing from a literary perspective, but it could also position them as two facets of the same person, the normative and the monstrous, to quote Wood, or the straight and the gay.
Introduced as an incredibly accomplished student, transferring to Miskatonic after studying in Zurich with an acclaimed professor, Herbert takes quick interest in Dan despite a bristly introduction, and quickly inserts himself into his life to the degree of moving in with him.
And they were roommates.
Oh my god, they were roommates.
Memes aside, this could actually respond to the retroactive idea of gay relationships being labelled as roommates or friends in the press. A pretty prolific example that comes to mind is Cary Grant and Randolph Scott, who lived together for 12 years in pretty obviously gay domestic bliss, being labelled as bachelors and roommates in magazines and newspapers.
Fellas, is it gay to live with another man?
He arrives on Dan's doorstep, interrupting just as Dan and Meg have finished having sex, and is quick to establish an instant rivalry with Meg, who makes her disdain for Herbert incredibly clear. Benshoff writes, in regards to the classic mad scientist horror formula present in Bride of Frankenstein, the monstrously queer gothic villain is also clearly marked within the text by the presence of an assertively normal heterosexualized couple, who serve as the centre of a naturalized and normative heterosexual equilibrium which the queer force disrupts. One or both members of this normal couple become involved in the villain's plot. The queer villain's desire for one or both members of the couple is one of the main thematic imperatives of the genre.
The correlation between RE-ANIMATOR and Frankenstein is clear from the start, what with Gordon pitching the former to be a retelling of the latter, and their sequel sharing the same name and plot structure, but they also correlate in telling a very similar tale in queer villainry.
The homosocial dynamic of Pretorius and Henry Frankenstein, as established in Bride of Frankenstein, has often been read as one of explicit queer subtext, and not just because it was made by a gay director, James Whale. In line with Benshoff's theory, Pretorius gets in between Frankenstein and his fiancée, Elizabeth, seducing and tempting him from heteronormativity to engage in the unnatural act of creating non-procreative life. A gay Mephistopheles, to quote David Scarl. Film historian Vito Russo also wrote, when considering Pretorius, the film doesn't designate the character as gay or queer, but instead refers to him as sissified, sissy itself being Hollywood code for homosexual. Here, established queer horror theory presents Pretorius as explicitly queer-coded and a seductive threat to the heteronormative dynamic presented by Frankenstein and Elizabeth.
While working as an indirect adaptation of Frankenstein, RE-ANIMATOR does incredibly similar things with its own queer villain. Well, he's not a villain, but you know what I mean.
Going back to the scene from before, Herbert is deliberately placed as the opposition to the normative heterosexual coupling that Dan and Meg represent through the film, and a threat to their relationship, which only makes it more interesting when Dan effectively chooses Herbert over Meg. After Herbert proves his capability to bring the dead back to life, following the death and subsequent reanimation of Dan's cat, Dan quickly becomes obsessed with Herbert and his work, going so far as to defend him when the two are suspended by Dean Halsey, perhaps an interesting take on the exclusion from institutions queer people often face. In the following scene, Dan immediately wants to talk to Herbert, but Meg begs him to reconsider.
But you've got to separate yourself from West.
Meg, don't you understand what he's done? What we could do?
What about what we could do?
Here, Meg is established as Dan's hinge to normativity, to heteronormativity, openly conceding to marriage, which she argued against before this threat to their relationship, and the prerequisites of a normal life, if he rejects Herbert and everything he represents. It is at this point that Herbert interrupts, reasserting himself as queer seducer and capturing Dan's attention away from Meg. As she grows more hysterical and angry, Herbert remains calm and collected, sarcastically rebuffing Meg's outrage and toying with Dan's empathetic nature. He even picks up on Meg's pet name for Dan.
Danny, listen to me!
The only way, Danny.
Adopting the monikers of the normative relationship and asserting himself as having the same intimate feelings of familiarity and ownership that Meg has for Dan, or at least replicating them.
Also, and I couldn't find a proper place to fit this in, but Meg's actress Barbara Crampton actually said in a recent interview that Herbert and Meg are indeed fighting over Dan in this scene, and their dynamic could easily be read as a love triangle.
Oh, I think there was definitely a triangle in the movie, and it was myself and Dan and Herbert West. Megan and Herbert West were foes, fighting for the same man.
I'm just saying, man, queer horror stays winning. I also feel that it would be remiss to not mention that Herbert is a little queer-coded in his own right.
RE-ANIMATOR makes some reference to Psycho, notably through the use of its score, composed by Richard Band, paying loving homage to the iconic Bernard Herrmann Psycho score. But, more notably, Paul Atencio wrote about Herbert and his performance from cult horror frequent Jeffrey Combs. Beady-eyed, his face hard, almost lacquered, Combs makes West into a brittle, slightly face psychotic in the Anthony Perkins mould, referencing Perkins' iconic performance of Norman Bates. With both character and actor having a particularly strong connection to the queer horror canon, it's noteworthy that multiple critics and academics pair the two characters so closely. I also think it's worth noting that there seems to be an emphasis on Combs' performance as being fey, intense, and exaggerated, as well as a consistent comparison of it to that of performances from Vincent Price and Anthony Perkins, both of whom have been discussed in regards to queer horror theory. Using the theory regarding Pretorius, RE-ANIMATOR represents its own queer seducer as especially demonstrative and, for lack of a better word, campy. We additionally have two outside sources, the RE-ANIMATOR novel adaptation by Jeff Rovin and the collaborative legacy of the RE-ANIMATOR that both hint Herbert may have more than just a professional interest in men, with the latter outright depicting him in a somewhat romantic relationship with a male classmate. This is especially interesting when the Bride of Frankenstein novel by Michael Argamont does very similar things in depicting Pretorius' queerness, with him outright saying, "Let us obey the biblical injunction. You, of course, have the choice of natural means. But as for me, I am afraid there is no choice open to me but the scientific way, to Frankenstein about the nature of human reproduction."
While these films make the queer coding of Pretorius and Herbert more ambiguous, extra-textually and in the fringes of the mainstream eye, it is much more obvious.
Bride of Frankenstein ends with Frankenstein running away at the sight of the monster with Elizabeth, leaving the queer seducer to die at the hands of their creations, reasserting that opposing heteronormativity will only end in bloodshed. And though RE-ANIMATOR ends with Herbert being presumably killed off screen, but only after a particularly intricate ritual between Herbert and Dan, Meg also dies. Thus, RE-ANIMATOR subverts the earlier convention that would re-establish heterosexual normality and outright rejects the previous convention that rejecting queerness is the only way to stay alive. The film does still end with their bittersweet reunion, though, as Dan takes up Herbert's syringe and attempts to bring her back to life, and the film culminates with her shriek of horror and an uncertain future. We might even argue that RE-ANIMATOR even queers heterosexuality in the broadest terms of queerness, since, in a sense, Dan and Meg transgress the borders of life and death and become liminal figures in their own right. But Herbert is the one who is resurrected for the sequel.
Hill didn't kill me. He didn't have the guts.
And not only is he resurrected, he and Dan have remained together during the time between the first and second films, still living together, still working together. In a sense, he successfully usurps Meg's position as Dan's companion, moving past queer seducer and into the realm of outright queer partnership.
Now, before I move on to the next section of this essay, I just want to take a moment to point out that while all this established film theory may support my queer reading of RE-ANIMATOR, there's also just a lot in text that supports this. I mean, a lot.
For one, throughout the franchise, Herbert doesn't express interest in anyone except Dan. Where Herbert is rude and combative to other scientists and students, he openly considers Dan to be the brightest Miskatonic has to offer and worthy of working alongside him. Where he is cold and dismissive of grief to others, he's almost warm and compassionate to Dan, offering what little empathy he can give openly when Dan is in distress. Also, Herbert touches Dan constantly. He hides behind Dan as they try to stamp out a reanimated cat in the basement. They practically cuddle up to each other as they reanimate it once more. He clutches Dan as a corpse in the morgue attacks him, and when they're being questioned by police, Herbert almost instinctively reaches out for Dan, holding his arm, a hand to his chest. And after the carnage in the morgue settles, Herbert hovers at Dan's side, and when Dan goes into shock, he pulls a blanket over him and embraces him. And though it can certainly be argued that these are all manipulation tactics, especially when considering Meg is in the room with them, her attention on her unfortunately reanimated father, that doesn't negate the fact that he exclusively pays this kind of attention to a man over a woman.
While the act of two men touching each other does not a queer horror make, these acts, in combination with what the theory has already established, makes the subtextual relationship between Dan and Herbert a little more textual.
I believe the subtext here is rapidly becoming a text.
Specifically, in the R-rated cut of the film, there's an extended scene in which Herbert attempts to inject himself with his reagent, his reanimation solution, as Dan watches in wide-eyed horror. Herbert assures him that it's a watered-down mix, just something so he doesn't have to sleep, before imploring him to help because his hands are shaking too much. Here, Herbert embodies an almost competitive obsessiveness with his work to the point of abstaining from sleep, and associates himself with a trait in gay men colloquially called velvet rage. About this, Dr. Joseph Burgo writes, "Many gay men are driven to build such an exquisite linear to their lives because they need to prove that they're winners, and demonstrating your success involves proving it to other people, which often means proving that you are better than they are.
He failed, not I.
This competitive nature in Herbert is especially highlighted when he opposes Dr. Hill, a lecherous and assuredly heterosexual researcher at Miskatonic who he constantly antagonizes, going as far as to designate him a plagiarist of his previous mentor's work. Going back to the scene, though Dan initially rejects him, eventually he sits by Herbert's side and injects the reagent into his arm. And after the injection is successfully completed, Herbert jerks to his feet, throws back his head, stiffens, shudders, and then relaxes as he smiles at Dan, apparently satisfied.
No wonder it's in the R rating. Anyway, on to the sequel.
Taking place 9 months after the first film, typically the gestation period of natural conception, Bride of RE-ANIMATOR sees Herbert and Dan, fresh from a Peruvian war zone where they worked as medics, working at Miskatonic University Hospital and living together in a small house located next to a cemetery, offering plenty of subjects for their experiments. No longer content with simple reanimation, Herbert discovers that his reagent can reanimate body parts by themselves, independent of a heart or brain, and he becomes hellbent on constructing an entire living person from disparate body parts. With producer-turned-director Brian Yuzna at the helm of Bride, fresh from the absurdly grotesque body horror film Society, Bride has a vastly different directorial vision compared to the last film, notably a much heavier emphasis on gore and body horror. Perhaps for this reason, as well as the supposedly less structured plot and script, Bride wasn't as widely regarded as RE-ANIMATOR was, even receiving some harsh reviews from critics calling it an anemic shadow of the first film, and praise for the film is largely focused within the cult afterlife and legacy of the franchise as a whole.
But if queer subtext was the heart of RE-ANIMATOR, it is the heart, the lungs, the liver, and the guts of its sequel.
While RE-ANIMATOR was primarily focused on Dan's growing obsession with Herbert and their subsequent partnership, Bride of RE-ANIMATOR is nothing if not preoccupied entirely with the weaving together of sex, death, and birth from its very beginning. Obviously disgusted by Herbert's new project, Dan announces with all seriousness that he's moving out, something that quite evidently breaks Herbert's heart. In a desperate plea, he uses his project to retain Dan's interest in him and keep him from leaving, practically tailoring the bride for Dan. Quite significantly, he uses the heart of Meg Halsey, the woman who is effectively his romantic rival, as the first piece to their creation, even using it to strengthen the connection between himself and Dan. Herbert allows himself to create a second Meg, a facsimile of the heteronormative life and normative conception that he initially rejected, almost as if it were a tool just to keep Dan near him. And surprise, surprise, Dan accepts his offer.
You know that thing when straight people will have a baby to save a failing relationship? Bride of RE-ANIMATOR is just a gay version of that, just with more gore and severed body parts.
To go back to Bride of Frankenstein for a moment, Benshoff continues, together the mad scientist and his sidekick become a major generic convention that is easily read as queer. The secret experiments they conduct together are chronicled in private, and the homosexual pair set out to procreate without the aid of a woman.
Dead pieces of this. With my hands, I created what no man's mind or woman's womb could ever hope to achieve.
Much like its predecessor, Bride of RE-ANIMATOR could easily be read as an attack of the family structure and the nature of reproduction. Benshoff's concept, as well as the homoerotic tension between Dan and Herbert, particularly comes to a head in the climax of Bride, when the two descend into their basement laboratory, the home of their secret experiments, to finish their creation, their own bride, a nightmarish if grotesquely erotic hodgepodge of female body parts that Herbert has stolen, tethered by the heart of Meg and the brain of a female patient Dan was close to.
I don't know what the fuck she's saying, but girl, I am living.
Though initially characterized as Herbert's foil, a meek assistant rather than mad doctor, Dan instead asserts himself and takes a hypodermic needle, a possible phallic metaphor in the eyes of Freud.
Because I've had enough of this dude.
From Herbert shaking hands with a calm and collected,
Let me.
As Herbert stares at him, wide-eyed and awe-inspired. They inject the solution directly into the bride's heart, a fitting representative of Dan's final attachment to Meg and his last hinge on the world of heteronormativity and that which is good. The resulting scene has Dan's hand on one of her breasts, Herbert's hand on the other, and Herbert's hand grasping Dan's shoulder, completing the circle and essentially rejecting that world for that which is truly and monstrously queer. And as Dan empties the needle, Herbert relaxes and lets out a sigh of satisfaction. Talk about phallic. About this scene, Dream With You, the Dr. Worm writes in their fantastic online essay, Together We Are Providence, which I've been quoting a few times throughout my own essay, the whole scene carries a sense of surface homoeroticism, as well as being a reflection on the deeper psychological aspects of two men coming together, literally and figuratively, in order to create new life. This is especially clear when we see Herbert's reaction and subsequent relationship to the animated bride. The relationship, such as it is more reminiscent of a parent and child than anything sexual or romantic, because he didn't build her for himself, but for Dan. Herbert even goes so far as to grasp Dan's hand before taking the bride's, a gesture that expresses the triumph of their partnership, like a new father clasping his wife's hand as he encounters his child for the first time. Indeed, the bride of RE-ANIMATOR and her conception at the hands of two men can be eloquently summed up as the majesty and power of the homosexual creator.
And as much as I would like to finish here, I do have to accept that there is another love interest in this movie.
After returning to Miskatonic Hospital and still mourning Meg, Dan tries to build a relationship with Francesca, a war zone journalist who he spent some time with in Peru. And now, rendered as partner rather than seducer, Herbert grows to be incredibly jealous and possessive over Dan, though this is characterized not with the sarcastic quips and petty vindictiveness he threw at Meg, but rather a jealous isolation, shutting himself in their basement while the two lovers bond upstairs. In the following scene, when Dan and Francesca retire to the bedroom, Herbert follows, hovering with an expression of thoughtful menace as he voyeuristically listens to them, only to repeat the same simpering sweet talk they shared as he and Dan reanimate their bride in the climax.
Your skin's so soft, so warm. So soft. So warm. But so cold in death.
Now, maybe we could argue that this manifestation of Herbert's jealousy isn't out of a possessive desire over Dan, but rather a desire for something else. In an interview about Bride, Jeffrey Combs seems to assert this reading, saying, ultimately there's a sad side to Herbert. In one scene, Dan is in bed making love with this woman and the camera cuts and you see that Herbert's watching them. It's kind of sad. He's just watching them quizzically, like, what is that intimacy there? I can't do that. I don't know what that is.
Combs doesn't come to any kind of conclusion with this train of thought, so we could infer anything from it, but personally, viewing Herbert as gay, or at the very least desirous of Dan, makes the scene in question pretty interesting.
While Dan, the object of his affection, is in bed with a woman, Herbert sits, almost dejected, alone in their basement laboratory and trying to distract himself with work. There's a kind of jealousy to it, but jealousy of what is down to the viewer. The queer, quotes Benshoff, is the taboo breaker, the monstrous, the uncanny. Like the Phantom of the Opera, the queer dwells underground, below the operatic overtone of the dominant, frightening to look at, desiring, as it plays its own organ, producing its own music. Herbert consciously separating himself from the world of the heterosexual, the dominant, by retreating to a basement of all places, situates him within the realms of some queer theory. Herbert knows that he cannot be a participant in the normative lifestyle that Dan seeks, so he outright rejects it in exchange for that which is unruly, defiantly, and angrily queer. So it's only natural that when Francesca faces this frightening and gruesome rejection of the dominant, the heteronormative, she runs from Dan, disgusting that he would even entertain such horror. Herbert watches placidly as she yells at Dan, before standing beside him, watching over Dan's hunched and shirtless form and tersely saying,
You're better off without her.
Sounding less like a scientific professional and more like a vengeful spouse, evidently pleased at Francesca's disgust.
At what point does homoeroticism become misogyny? And at what point does misogyny become homoeroticism? Much to think about. Fellas, is it gay to hate women? Also, and this is unrelated to the point, but just as a side, I listened to the actor's commentary of Bride of RE-ANIMATOR just to get some insight into the character performances, and Bruce Abbott actually compares Herbert to Norman Bates in this scene.
Who's listening? Well, Herbert is.
Mm-hmm. Not only listening.
Well, but he doesn't understand what's going on.
Of course he does.
No, he doesn't.
Are you kidding?
That's what this whole moment is about, right here.
So psycho.
What is going on down
Unbelievably
there?
Anthony Perkins.
Why don't I have that in my life?
Well, he did taxidermy. You reanimate. What's the diff?
Maybe they were more aware of its queer coding when we first see him, huh?
To continue, in horror, the monster is never just a monster. They're always responding to a fear of something. So when we examine the representations of body horror in both films, comparing RE-ANIMATOR to what is presented in Bride may reflect a tremendous amount of intersexual turmoil and frustration with the heterosexual model of love and romance. Instead of the gory, if relatively hinged zombified corpses of RE-ANIMATOR, Bride depicts freakish mishmashes of male and female body parts. Despite how chaotic the reveal is in the climax of Bride, we may interpret these creations as a means for Herbert to work out his own sexual frustration, his jealousy, and perhaps his abject disgust with the sexual coming together of men and women and the role of reproduction in normative society. So, I suppose it makes sense that he falls victim to them. In the final climax of Bride of RE-ANIMATOR, Dan rejects the bride, and in that vein rejects Herbert for Francesca, finally coming to his senses amidst a battlefield of gore and violence. Heartbroken, the bride tears out Meg's heart and crumbles into a pile of tissue and flesh. Once again, overwhelmed by his creations, Herbert is trapped, and once again, presumably killed underneath the collapsing crypt, while Dan and Francesca both survive and escape together. Maybe this could be read as a permanent separation of Dan from Herbert, particularly when considering Dan's absence from the subsequent Re-Animator film in 2003, Beyond Re-Animator, explained in a throwaway line about Herbert's old assistant turning him into the police.
My last partner turned state's evidence against me. I'm expecting better things of you.
Though Bride initially represented some truly radical rejections of dominant heteronormative concepts such as marriage and conception, Dan's choice to leave Herbert and escape with Francesca, just like the Bride of Frankenstein before it, ultimately reasserts that opposing heteronormativity will only end in bloodshed, something the previous film outright rejected until the very end. Tumblr user Herbert West-Re-Animator writes in another fantastic online essay that I consulted with heavily through my own writing, Re-Animator and Passion/Desire, that Bride's ending is a commentary on Dan's ego, elaborating, he couldn't get what he needed from his old life with Meg, but it turns out he couldn't get it from his new life with Herbert either, and continues to say the assumption that Dan turns away from Herbert and the forbidden desires he represents is a safe one to make.
The lack of conclusion for Dan and Herbert's story leaves this essay at a somewhat frustrating crossroad.
While on the surface presenting gory body horror and bombastic performances, the Re-Animator franchise ultimately revolves around philosophical questions about life, death, love, desire, and co-creation. Beyond Re-Animator suffers from a great deal, but what it mostly suffers from is a lack of internal struggle and a real lack of heart, and I do think that's partly down to Dan's absence.
Ultimately though, both Re-Animator and Bride of Re-Animator successfully demonstrates a queer narrative through its use of queer horror tropes, as well as its depiction of queer coding and homoerotic imagery alongside its depiction of gruesome body horror. Thanks to its legacy, as well as the uniquely queer cultural afterlife that the franchise has found in recent years, it truly deserves a place as a queer horror text.
Hello video nasties, thank you for watching this video essay. Feels good to be talking about queer horror again, even if this one isn't a slasher, but yeah, it's part of the series now. Be sure to check out my Twitter at videonasty, same way it's spelt here, if you want some horror hot takes. And if you want to support me further, you can swing by my Patreon for early access to scripts, exclusive content, and if you just feel like helping me out. Until the next one, video nasties, stay safe and remember to always stay spooky.